This is going to be a quick video where we're going to demonstrate how to scrape data from the web using BeautifulSoup and requests in Python. And we're going to model that data in a very simple way with Pydantic and then perform some calculations on that data. So we're going to combine the use of Pydantic, BeautifulSoup and requests. And what we're going to do in this video is we're going to scrape the episode list from the Talk Python to Me podcast. And we're going to fetch the data from this table where we have a show number, a date, a title and some guests, as well as the URL for each individual episode. So let's get started. I'm going to go to VS Code and I've got a couple of imports at the moment. We're importing the requests module and we're also importing the BeautifulSoup object from BeautifulSoup. Now I've defined a couple of URLs here. This is the URL for the page we want to scrape, which is this page that we saw here. And I also have the base URL for the Talk Python website. We're going to use that later in the video. Now in order to follow along with the video, you should activate a Python virtual environment and we need to install the packages that we're going to use, and we can use this command for that. It's the pip install command, and we're going to install Pydantic, requests and BeautifulSoup 4. Now I've already done this, so that's not going to install them on my system, but you need to run that in order to be able to use those packages. Once you've got them installed, we can start writing the code to scrape the data from this URL. Now we're going to use requests to send a GET request to that page, and we're going to get back a response when we do that. So we're going to use the requests.get method, and we can pass the URL into that in order to send that request, and we're going to get back some HTML content. Now just to validate that we're getting the correct response, I'm going to go back to the page here and I'm going to take this title here about the Azure data centers and I'm going to copy that in here, and we're going to check to see if that string exists in the response.content property. Now these response objects in the requests module, they have a property.content, and as it says here, that gives you back the content of the response in bytes. Now actually I'm going to convert this to text using the .text property on the response, and that will give you back the Unicode response. Now we can check this by running the script, so I'm going to run this on the terminal, and I've called this script scraper.py. When we run that, we get back true here, so that means that we're getting some text here in the response that contains that title from the page. So we know we're getting the HTML back from this page. We can now start processing the content using BeautifulSoup. So let's go back to VS Code, and what we're going to do is we're going to take the response.text and we're going to pass that into the BeautifulSoup object that we have here. So let's do that just now. We're passing response.text and we're going to parse this text response as HTML. So we're going to pass a second argument of the HTML parser in BeautifulSoup, and we can store the result in a variable called soup. So let's get rid of the print statement, and I'm going to execute this code just to make sure everything is working, and we get no errors, no issues when we run that. Now what we want to get is each episode from this table. Now this is a table element in HTML, and if we inspect the DOM here, we can see that all of the rows with the data that we need are children of this table body. And the table body has a number of table rows as direct children, so we're going to start by extracting each of those. So let's go back to VS Code and we can use this BeautifulSoup object, and we're going to get back a variable here called rows by calling the soup.select method, and we can pass a CSS selector to this. So we're going to get the table body and we want to get all of the immediate children that are table rows, and that's going to give us back a Python list with an element for each row in this table. So let's see if we're getting something back here. I'm going to print the very first row by indexing in at 0, and we're going to see what we get back on the terminal. So I'm running this now and we get back the HTML content for the first table row in that table, and you can see the title of that particular podcast, it was Python in Excel, and that matches what we see here on the web page. So now that we have the rows, we can start extracting each piece of information from those rows. So how do we approach this task? What we're going to do is we're going to create a for loop and we're going to iterate over each row in this table. And for each row, again, we're going to inspect the DOM here, and we can see that each table row has 4 table data elements. And the first one is for the show number, the second one is for the title, and so on. So what we're going to do in the for loop is we're going to create another for loop and extract each table data element, and then we're going to parse the data that we need from that element. So let's go back to VS Code now, and we're going to code this up. So I'm going to make the terminal smaller here and remove the print statement. And now we have the rows, we need to iterate over each one of those. So for each row in the rows, what I'm going to do here is get back a variable called data, and I'm going to call a function that I'm going to define in a second, and that's going to be called extract episode data, and we're going to pass the row that we're iterating over into that function. After we get the data back, I'm also going to print that out, and for now I'm going to break out of the for loop so we only print the first element. So let's now define the function that's going to take the row that we've got from the for loop, and it's going to process that and extract each of these pieces of information from the table. Now I'm going to do this at the top above all of the other code. You might want to break stuff like this into its own file, its own module. I'm going to define everything in one file. So we're going to copy the name of this function. It's called extract episode data, and it's going to take a row, and that's going to be an instance of a tag object from BeautifulSoup. So let's import that. And what this function is going to do is it's going to take that tag with all of its children with the data we need. It's going to process that, and it's going to return a dictionary with the data for that row. So that's the function signature. For now, I'm actually just going to pass on this. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a Pydantic model now. And that model is going to define the structure of the data that we're going to get back for each row. Now again, we're going to do this at the top of the file. So what I'm going to do first of all is from Pydantic, we're going to bring in a couple of imports. We're going to import the base model, and I'm also going to import this object here. It's called any HTTP URL. Maybe a better word for that is a type, not an object. But we're going to use this type hint in the Pydantic model, and that's going to be to represent the actual URL for the podcast. So let's get started writing this model. It's going to inherit from the base model, and this is going to represent an episode that we're pulling from the website, and it inherits from the base model, as I said before. Now the first field that we're going to define is the show number, and that's going to be of type integer. And if we go back to the Talk Python website, you can see the show number here is an incrementing number, and it started off from number 0 presumably, and you can see that at the bottom. So the show number is a very simple field, it's just a number. Then we have the date as well. So let's go back to the model, and we're going to define a field called date, and that's going to be of type date. So we need to import that from Python's datetime module at the top. So we now have the date field, and then the next field is for the title. Now I want to get the title of the podcast, but we also want to extract the link from this as well. So we're going to create two fields here. The first one's going to be very simple. The title will be of type string, and then we're going to have the URL for this episode, and that's where we're going to use this any HTTP URL type. And as VS Code says here, this is a type that will accept any HTTP or HTTPS URL. And there's one final field in the table, and that's the guest, and that's going to be a string again. So let's go back to VS Code, and I'm going to add the field guest here, and that is our Pydantic model. It contains these 5 fields, and we're going to scrape the data from this website, and for each row we want to create a model with those fields. And what Pydantic is going to do is it's going to perform some automatic type conversions for us, as we're going to see a little bit later in the video. So now that we have this model, let's now write the function to extract the data for each row. Now to start with, I'm going to set up an empty dictionary called model data, and we're gradually going to add the data that we're extracting to this dictionary as we iterate over the table data elements. Now in order to get the row data, which is the table data elements, we're going to use the row that's passed into the function, and that's a tag object in BeautifulSoup, and that therefore contains that same select method. So we're going to pass a very simple CSS selector here, and that's to get the table data elements that are children of the table row. And just to reiterate what that's going to return here, if we look at the very first row in the table, we have the table row, and that table row contains 4 table data children, and each one of those is going to allow us to extract the data that we want. So let's go back to VS Code. We're going to get these table data elements, and then again we're going to create a for loop, and I'm going to use the enumerate function in Python, and let's get each table data element, and again we're going to use enumerate here, and we're enumerating over the row data that we got above. So we have 4 table data elements. We're going to iterate over those, and we're going to use the enumerate function so that we know which index of iteration we are on. So to scrape this data, let's start with the very first column here for the show number. I'm going to find that element in the DOM, and that is the first child of the table row. So what we need to do here is check the index, and if I is equal to 0, we know we're extracting the show number. So we're going to take this model data dictionary here, and we're going to add a key here called show number, and we're going to set that equal to the text within the table data element that we're iterating over from that row data. So that's going to handle the show number. Now I do want to perform a small transformation on this. We want this to be a numerical value, so we want to get rid of this hash symbol. In order to do that, we're going to take the text that we got back here, and we're going to call the .replace function in Python. This is a function defined on strings, and we're going to replace that hash symbol with an empty string. So that takes care of the show number. We can then check if the index is 1, And I appreciate this is quite a manual way of doing this, but it is going to work for this example because we have a fixed number of columns in this table and there's only 4 of them. Now the second one is the date here, and it's very simple to extract that. If we look at the table data element, we just need to get the text here and we don't need to perform any transformations. So let's add a field or a key to the model data called date, and we're going to set that equal to the table data's text, and we don't need to do anything with that, so that's all we need to do for the date. Now we're going to check if the index that we're iterating on is number 2, and this is the more complex one, so I'm going to add a little comment here. What we want to do is we want to get the anchor tag with the link to that particular podcast for this row, and from that anchor tag we want to extract the href and add the base URL to that, as well as the text within the anchor tag, and that's going to contain the title of that podcast episode. So let's go back to the HTML and we're going to look at this particular element. What we have in the table data for this column is an anchor tag, so we need to find that from the children of the table data element. So let's do that now. We're going to create a variable called link, and we're going to take the table data element and we're going to call the BeautifulSoup.find function and get that anchor tag. Once we have the anchor tag, we're going to take the model data and we're going to add the URL field to that. And in order to do that, we're going to take this base URL here, so let's copy that, and to that we're going to add the actual href that's present on the anchor tag. So let's go to the DOM again. If we look at the href here on the right hand side, you can see that this starts with a slash, so we don't have the domain here, we just have the particular href on that domain. So we need to add the base URL to that. Now how do we get the href element from this link tag? In order to do that, we can use the BeautifulSoup tags.attributes dictionary, and that dictionary has a key for all of the attributes that are present on the HTML element, and we want to get the href attribute. That's going to give us back that link, and we're appending that to the website's base URL. So that should take care of the URL. We also need to look at the title itself. So we're going to add another key called title to that model data dictionary. And that's very simple. We're going to take the anchor tag, which is called link in our program, and we're just going to get the text from that. So that should hopefully handle the anchor tag. There's one more column in the table, and we're going to get that now. So we're going to check if the index is equal to 3, and that should be the final index. And then we can take the model data and add a key of guest by setting it equal to the table data.text. Now the last thing we need to do in this function is just return this model data. So let's go to the bottom here, and after the for loop we're just going to return the model data. So that's our function. It's called extract episode data, and if we go down here we're iterating over each row and we're calling that function for each row and getting back that dictionary. So let's test this out. I'm going to expand the terminal at the bottom here and clear that out. We're going to run the program again and let's see what we get back from this program. And you can see we have now keys with the show number, and that's set to the value 446. We have the date, we have the URL, and we also have the title of the podcast episode, as well as the guest name. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to convert each one of these dictionaries to the Pydantic model that we created, and that's going to perform some useful type conversions and validation. Now here's an example of some of these type conversions. The show number that we have here is currently a string in this dictionary, with the number 446 as a string. If we look at the Pydantic model that we defined earlier in this video, you can see that the show number should be an integer. Now Pydantic, when we create this model and pass the dictionary of data in, it's going to automatically convert that to an integer, because what this string represents can actually be converted to a number. So it's going to do that for us automatically. And very similarly for the date, that's currently stored in the dictionary as just a string, but when we create the Pydantic model, we're going to get that converted to the date type in Python. And as one last example of some validation, we have a URL that's set to the any HTTP URL type. So when we pass in the URLs from the website, if any of these do not match a valid URL scheme, and that's to say a valid HTTP URL, then that's going to be rejected by Pydantic, so we get that immediate validation, and we can be sure if nothing goes wrong that we have data that we expect in the application. So let's go back to the code now. We're going to scroll down to where we get back the data from calling that function, and what we're going to do now is we're going to set up an empty list above the for loop called episodes, and we're going to populate that episode list here by calling the .append function. Now what we're going to append to the list is a Pydantic model at each step in this for loop. So we're going to create a model which was called episode, and we're going to unpack the data that we got back from calling this function. So this function here will return a dictionary of key value pairs, and we want to pass each one of those in as a keyword argument to the Pydantic model. That's going to create the model and populate it with the data, and then we're appending that to this episodes list. So let's test that out now. What I'm going to do is remove the break statement, and we're going to print the very first element in the episodes list. Now we can see what we got before. We had a Python dictionary here. If we rerun scraper.py, this time we're getting back something different, and this represents a Pydantic model class. And if you look at the types here, for example, the show number, that is an integer now, it's not a string, and the date is an instance of the Python date object. And as well as that, if we look at the URL field, you can see that that has a different representation as well, and that has validated that we have a valid URL in this data for each one of the rows in the table. And we can actually represent this whole piece of code here. It's 4 lines of code, but it can be represented as a list comprehension as well. So what I'm going to do is just go down below that, and I'm going to reset the episodes list here, and we're going to set that equal to a list comprehension in Python, and I'm going to comment out what we have above just to show how we would do this. So in the list comprehension, we're going to create an episode, and what we're going to do is we're going to call that extract episode data function and pass the row in, and we're going to do that for each row in the rows that we have from this statement above here. And don't forget to close this bracket here when we create the episode. Now I'm going to remove the code here so that this looks a bit more coherent. What we're doing is we're getting the rows back by looking at the table body and getting all of its children table rows. That's going to give us all of the rows on the page, and then we use the list comprehension, and for each one of the rows, and actually I can see I've still got a syntax error here. For each one of the rows, what we're doing is we're passing that row into the function we defined, and then unpacking the dictionary that we get back from that to create the episode object. Now let's see if this still works. I'm going to save the file and rerun the code, and hopefully we get back the same Pydantic model, and you can see that below. Now at this point we have a list that's populated with the data for all of the episodes on the Talk Python podcast. We can then save this data to a database, we can save it to the file system, or we could do anything we want with this data. We could also search through the data or order the data in a particular way. It's going to be very easy to do now that we have the data in that format. Now what I'm going to do is remove the print statement, and we're going to define a very simple application that takes some text in from the user, and then it uses that text to search through the episode list and find any episodes whose name contains that text. Now to do this, we're going to go to the top, and I'm going to import the pprint function from Python's pprint module. Once we've got that, we can go back down here, and we're going to get a search term from the command line. So we're going to use the input function in order to do that. And this is a built-in function in Python that's going to read a string from standard input, and that takes a prompt as an argument. So we're going to pass a prompt here of enter a search term. Now the user is going to enter a search term, and then we want to look at each episode in this list, and we want to find if the episode contains that search term. So let's create a variable called results, and again we're going to use a list comprehension here, and we're going to look at each episode E, and that's coming from the episodes list. And we're going to add a condition here. We're going to look at the search term, and we're going to lowercase that within this for loop. And once we've done that, we're going to check if that search term is in the episode's name. So we're going to look at the episode E that we're iterating over, and we're going to look at the title property. And again, we want to lowercase that just to make sure there's no case mismatches. Now the title is what we want to look on. That's one of the fields in the Pydantic model, and that represents the name of the podcast. You can see that in the third column in the table. So we're going to look at those, and we're going to try and find any episodes who have a name that contains what's been entered by the user. And once we've found those results, what we're going to do at the bottom is just add a couple of print statements. We're going to print out a message, episodes with the term, and then we're going to reference what the user has typed in. And then we're going to use the pprint function to print out any results that contain that text. So let's save this, and we're going to expand the terminal and try this out now. If I run the python scraper.py command, we now get the prompt to enter a search term. Now I'm going to enter html here, and you can see we get back a couple of results. There are 2 episodes in the results. The first one contains the title of HTML for Django developers and all of us. and the second has the title 𝗦liche clean dynamic HTML pages. So by doing this, we're taking some input from the user and we're able to search through the list of Pydantic models and extract the episodes that match what the user has entered. Now let's try this with a couple of other search results. I'm going to also look for the term pandas, which is a very popular data package in Python, and we get back some titles that contain pandas. For example, understanding pandas visually with pandas tutor, and a few more here as well. Let's search for something else. I'm going to search for Django here, and as you'd expect, there are loads of episodes here that reference Django. Let's do one last one here. I'm going to search for PyTest, which is a popular Python testing package, and we get back 3 results here for episodes of Talk Python to Me that contain PyTest in the title. Now that's nearly all for this video. Before we finish, I want to just talk about the Pydantic model a little bit. For this data that we have in this small program, it might be considered overkill to create a Pydantic model to model such simple data, but I think it gives you a very clear, logical way of looking at the data. You can create a class with the fields that you need, and as I mentioned earlier on, you get the automatic type conversion for things like the date and the show number. These are coming into the model as strings, but Pydantic is clever enough to perform those type coercions to whatever we define here, if it's possible. And we can also define validations on the model very simply using the types, such as this one here, but also we can write custom validators as well. Now I'm going to push this code to a GitHub repository that's going to be linked in the description. If you have any suggestions for future content, let us know in the comments. But that's all for this video. Give it a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.